Is the career ladder an actual ladder, or is it more of a jungle gym?
Career ladder implies that I do this step and then this step and then this step and I rise. Jungle gym implies that it's all random.
This trend of is particularly young men who are opting out of work and school and are dubbing themselves NEETs. That is an acronym for someone who is not employed in education or training.
To me, this sounds much more like a perspective problem than an actual problem.
Hello and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are back this week. Jonathan is back from a bit of a longer trip. We are very grateful when Jonathan has the opportunity to get a break and is able to go out with his family and enjoy some time. So you guys went out to the Smoky Mountains, and you were just telling me about how the fact that you guys encountered quite a lot of wildlife out that direction.
Yeah, my 4 and 2-year-old are obsessed with bears. I'm not really sure why. They've been talking about bears nonstop for the last 3 or 4 months, and we encountered not 1, not 2, but 13 different bear encounters while we were in the Smoky Mountains, and so they were absolutely entranced by this, most of which happened on the front porch of the house that we were staying in. And so I was sharing with David earlier that bears are a lot of fun. I live in an area where bears get chased by hunters more often than not, and I kind of prefer those bears to the ones that we had, which were extremely familiar, and I'm just old enough to be a little bit nervous around familiar bears. But my 4 and 2-year-old thought it was the coolest thing ever. And between that and all the hiking we did, I was sharing with David that my 2-year-old every day would wake up and the first thing he'd say is like, "Daddy, go hiking, like, you know, go for a walk, climb a mountain." And we had a really, really fun time. So,
well, plenty of wildlife. Glad that none of it got too terribly close.
Yeah,
probably closer for the comfort, but
it was no dangerous encounters, but lots of encounters. And so it was definitely interesting. 13 bear sightings, 2 bobcat sightings. So I think those are pretty interesting. Yeah, not normal large size fauna to see around for sure. So.
Cool. Well, our question that we are going to try to tackle today is does not have to do with wildlife, but it does relate, I think, in a very indirect way. The question actually was posed by one of our assistant podcast producers, Bella. So shout out to her for this question. And we thought that it would be really interesting to kick around. Is the career ladder an actual ladder, or is it more of a jungle gym? So again, I'll repeat that. Is the career ladder an actual ladder, or is it more of a jungle gym? And so I thought that this would be a really interesting question to kick around. And I love the phrasing of that, first of all, comparing it from just a straight ladder to more of a jungle gym. So, Jonathan, what are your initial thoughts to that question?
Well, we just got the question straight from Bella. We didn't have a chance to ask her any additional questions about it. And so I had a couple of quick impressions just from the question itself. I think, and Bella can correct us later if we're wrong, but I think this question is a little bit like, you know, a career ladder implies that I do this step and then this step and then this step and I rise. You know, in other words, you know, the point of my career is to move up my career. I climb the ladder, and that implies that there's rungs to climb. And so there's a linear, logical, kind of already established path. And a jungle gym implies that it's all random. And so I think that that's a good question. And I think we can answer that question that way. And, you know, to spoil the answer a little bit, I think clearly with an age of technology and rapid change, it looks a lot more like a jungle gym. I don't know of not too many linear places. There are places like that, but they're more rare than common. And I think that that's a change over the last maybe generation or two. But David, you and I were discussing this a little bit. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the other part that I think is interesting about a jungle gym is that when I think about it is that a ladder, there is only one direction to move. You are only going up or down. There's only 2 directions in that case. Whereas with a jungle gym, like there are lots of different directions. So like you can move sideways, and potentially in order to move to a spot that you're wanting to go to ultimately, you have to move down in order to actually maneuver your way around the equipment in a way that you can actually actually get to where you want to go. And so I think there is an unhealthy expectation a lot of the times nowadays that you will only ever go up, and any maneuver that you might make in your career that does not directly take you upwards is a bad maneuver, because I think that there are a lot of circumstances where potentially something that a lot of people might consider a downward move in your career could actually be a very good one.
Yeah, and I think that's we see that as a problem, and it is maybe a problem if you're a young person sitting at the bottom looking at a maze of opportunities and going, I'm not sure which bar to grasp. But maybe a plea here to sort of change perspective slightly and say, there were times when a vertical climb up a ladder was kind of the accepted social norm. And if you weren't going up the ladder, you had some social stigma to go with that. And I think that that's mostly gone, right? I mean, like and so that gives us this kind of interesting opportunity where we can really adjust our work and our career type expectations based on some other factors. And so, yeah, there's times when people say, hey, I want to do something a little different, or I want to prioritize things a little differently. And we talked about this in our Balance podcast a little bit ago, David. And so I think there's more flexibility there and less stigma for that kind of flexibility. What I was about to say is that climbing a ladder, so when I think of a ladder, I think of work. Like I use a ladder to clean my gutters, and I'm not particularly excited about that. I use a ladder to get shingles up to the top of a roof. I use a ladder to crawl up to do something, and it's probably going to be either unpleasant or at least a little dicey because I'm at the top of a ladder. I had to climb a ladder recently to get on a roof and clean some outside windows. And nothing about that was particularly fun. When I think of a jungle gym, I think of, play. And I think of, there's some more freedom there for sure in terms of which way we move. We talked about that, but also some more creativity and some more interest. And actually, in some ways, if we rephrase it that direction, I'm pretty interested in that because I don't see work as a translation to drudgery. Synonymous with drudgery is the word I'm looking for. I don't see work as synonymous with drudgery. I see work as one of the primary creative outlets that I have in my life where I can actually create value, produce productivity, and do things that are meaningful. And I think that that's not unique. I think that that's a potential and a possibility for every single person. And in that sense, a jungle gym looks a lot more attractive than just climbing a ladder. So
yeah. No, I agree. I think I think the easy thing that a lot of our minds, the listeners' minds, might go to when they hear that is they might hear the old adage that Jonathan, you're gonna cringe as soon as I say this, and I'll let you tell us why. But is the old adage, find a job you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And I have a feeling that some people who may not be familiar with us or may not have heard us talk about this might hear what you just said and go, okay, well, that just means that you happen to be one of the lucky few that has a job that they really love and that you're made for and that you finally arrived there. Most of the rest of us are not lucky enough to get there and are just, drudging away in the trenches of jobs that we don't enjoy. So I think that that's not a terribly uncommon perspective nowadays. And so, Jonathan, what would you say to that?
Well, if you're a new listener, welcome to one of the most oft repeated phrases. If you ever listen to me speak or something on the podcast, if you're a longtime listener, we can say this all together. We consider that kind of perspective, that kind of advice, a big pile of stinking garbage. And so there's two reasons we say that. The first is that if you're a young person and somebody tells you do something you love and you'll never work another day in your life, then therefore all jobs become hobbies. Like, in other words, you have to jobify your hobby. Now, there may be places where that's a good thing to do, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that rarely works out the way people think it is. And so when you get young people and they say, well, then I want to be a singer, a performer, I want to race mountain bikes, I want to do, in other words, they equate fun with work, and that is almost always a hobby. And so they try to translate those things. And first, there's a problem there. all work involves some drudgery. I know that sounds a little different from what I just said, but there's an aspect of all work that requires effort, and there's things that are not as much fun. And so that then becomes, I wanted to race mountain bikes for a living, and I didn't realize that meant that I had to live outside of live in a Subaru Outback for 9 months out of the year as I'd travel around the country trying to go to these races and not break bones. In other words, there's an aspect of work and striving that is in all things, which is not a bad thing. But sometimes if you think like, I'm just going to ride my bike for fun, you don't see that. But the bigger piece, and the piece that it's way more important here, is that you can easily dismiss this argument by saying, is there anybody who enjoys their job who's not working in a hobby? And the answer is most people who enjoy their job are not working in a hobby. And so then the next question logically is, well, why is it they love their job? And we teach this in multiple places. We've written about it in books. We talk about this in live events. We've done classes about this. And the answer is, when you do something that you think makes a difference in the world, and you get to choose how to do it, and what you do pays the bills, almost everybody finds that they enjoy and love that. And I think that and we can break down the details of what that looks like, but I want to get to something deeper, which is to say, why is that? Why does it work that way? And I think that there's a fundamental, foundational part of reality in terms of the way the world works. I think you were created to work. I think that this is established in the very first verses of Genesis. And if you were created to work, then when you do something that makes a difference in the world, when you create value, you're acting as somebody made in the image of God. And when you get to choose how to do that, you're practicing some of the autonomy and some of that responsibility that God has given you as well. And when you do that in a way that creates value and helps other people, that is deeply, richly, soul-satisfyingly good. And that kind of work is available to every single person. And it's not limited to specific kinds of careers or jobs. But it does require a rethinking of the goodness and the inherent value of work. And that's, I think, the really critical lesson that more and more seems to be we have a cultural famine here in terms of people understanding and having what I would consider to be a healthy and good perspective about work.
Yeah, this does harken back to a few episodes ago. We did an episode earlier in the year about creating value and the significance of that. And so if you want to hear us talk a little bit more about that, I think definitely go back and check out that episode. But the point that I think you were alluding to that we were talking about a little bit earlier before we started recording was that one of our staff, Victoria, shared an article with us about a new trend that has popped up in the workforce. And we can include a link to this particular article in the description below of this trend of is particularly young men who are opting out of work in school and are dubbing themselves NEET, N-E-E-T. So that is an acronym for someone who is not employed in education or training. And just to try to kind of steelman this a little bit, essentially their perspective is that they look at the job market and the economy. They see that there are the opportunities that are out there. They don't see the jobs that are available as being able to go anywhere, or if they have a particular field that they're looking for a job in, then the opportunities are either non-existent or extremely hard to get into. And then even if they do get a job, then they see where the current economy is heading and how it is significantly more challenging to build wealth and to actually attain monetary success or do things like afford housing, and especially if you want to actually purchase a house or something like that. And so they just see all these limiting factors and just go, why would I even try at this point? Because everything is way more stacked against me than it ever has been. And so at this point, there are all of these other influences that are giving me opportunities to not really pursue those things and to instead just give me a way to just feel satisfaction without pursuing those things. And they feel like they can still have a fulfilling life without that. So That is a unfortunately a very growing more and more common perspective, and I personally think that there are some factors in there that like I can see how they are coming to those conclusions, but I do think that we have some counter arguments to those conclusions. So, Jonathan, I'll let you kick us off with those.
Well, so good job seal manning that. The last part, though, is that true? So I was just trying to think back to the article. You know, can have a satisfying life without that. Did you get the impression from reading the article, David, that the argument was that they could have a satisfying life? Because I feel like the article kind of said it was more of an admission of defeat than it was a claim of victory. You know what I mean? Like, in other words, adopting that acronym, saying I'm a NEET, was not a kind of triumphant stick it in the eye of the man, I'm not going to participate in the system. It was more of a sign. I felt like it was more of a sign of defeat. Like,
kind of a resignation.
Yeah, it's like a resignation. Like it's like, well, having said all those things that you mentioned, I've looked at that, shrugged my shoulders, and said I can't deal with this, and I'm out. And so I think even that article, the example they had, it was pretty interesting. The person there was pretty clearly blaming, if I'd had early intervention, if I'd had some, which I don't know that person, and I don't think the reporter knew that person either. But it was interesting to me was that there was no acceptance of responsibility for his situation. There was definitely I didn't like this dead end job. I didn't get the services I needed. I didn't get the help I needed at a certain time. Therefore, I'm kind of stuck and I'm done, and it's not really my fault, but I'm not doing anything about it. Is that a fair assessment of the article?
I think so. Yeah. It was, and I think there's just kind of been a community around it because there have just been more and more of these particularly young men, although I think there are probably some young women who are also included in that, just going, well, I don't really feel like I could do anything. And I know that there's a bunch of other people who also feel the same way. So we'll kind of band together and just find comfort in knowing that there's a bunch of other people who also feel this way.
So there's a challenge here, David, I think, because you and I are working. And so if you're a person who fits in this category and you're listening to us, you're like, doesn't apply to you. You've got a job, right? And so there's a little bit of almost anything we say is suspect from that position. And so I think you did a good job steel manning that. I think kind of looking at it from the opposite direction, it would be, to me, this is a matter of, I have to say this carefully because I don't want to sound here by telling you what I'm trying not to do. Maybe I can be careful about this. I'm not trying to sound condescending, and I'm not trying to be dismissive. But I think there's a risk of both of those things. In that, to me, this sounds much more like a perspective problem than an actual problem. And immediately be like, well, you're not dealing with the economy. Nice, whatever, mister. You're already, you're working and you've got a job and all these kinds of things. But, to me, I'm always interested in historical realities, right? And so this is still barely in living memory for some people. We had something called the Great Depression. And what's always been striking to me about the Great Depression is it is a cataclysmic work event, right? It's really hard to find employment. And yet, during that time period, the vast majority of people were still employed. Does that make sense? Like I don't remember what the numbers are. They're astoundingly high unemployment numbers, but it's like 10 or 20% or something. Well, that's still 8 out of 10 people working, right? I mean, like, in other words, a cataclysmic work event still has the vast majority of people working. We're not even anywhere in the realm of that sort of reality now. And then, of course, it requires us to step back a little bit and say, are these challenges that are claimed in this article real? Clearly they are. I have young adults who are my children, and they're facing a difficult economy in terms of especially housing costs and rising costs and all those things. And David, I think you're in that position as well. And so we're not dismissing that. We're not shrugging our shoulders and saying that's no big deal. At the same time, I do think it requires a backing up and looking at this and saying the purchasing power. Inflation has robbed us of purchasing power. I'm not dismissing that, but what's available for the purchasing power that you have is astounding in the face of world history, right? I mean, you have access to AIs that are free. through machines that are well within the range of even people with modest work in terms of smartphones and laptops and tablets and things like that. And access to technology and the ability to speak and to create and to do things that are just mind blowing, even from 5, 6, 10 years ago. And so this kind of, I think, loops back exactly to Bella's point. What is really different? Well, the difference would be a generation or two ago, clarity would have been easy. You get on the ladder and you start climbing, right? And what's missing today is the ladder may not be there. Like it's you have to build your own ladder, or you have to go through the jungle gym, or you have to hang upside down, or to David's point, you have to drop off and go a different route. And yet, I would say before there was one ladder or two ladders against one wall, right? And now you've got a jungle gym that stretches off over the horizon in the distance. And you're not even sure where it goes, but it offers almost infinite possibilities. And then it's a question of like, which is better? And I don't know that I can answer that, but I can tell you which sounds more interesting to me. You know what I mean? Like if faced with the idea of like, it's easy, just take this step and go up this ladder, that just does not sound very attractive at all. Or it's like, here's the jungle gym. I don't know which way you go, but you can pick a lot of different directions. All right. That's initially kind of terrifying. But as we tell our students all the time, it becomes less terrifying when you start walking. Like you start climbing something, you start moving, all of a sudden the next possibility become clear and apparent.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point about the ladder analogy too. I was just thinking that historically there was a lot of paths, especially in trades, where there was a very clear linear path where you could just like start out in an apprenticeship and you would be able to work through, and you were pretty much guaranteed, for the rest of your life to be able to make a very good living wage doing that particular craft that you started in. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. Even if you get into a tech forward industry like, say, cybersecurity, for example, that's going to be completely different than it is now in the next 10 to 15 years and so on and so forth. And even a lot of the trades are getting dramatically affected by that. And so that is intimidating to some extent, yes. But I think that your point about there is a massive number of new opportunities for those who have the creativity to navigate it are really cool. And I think that creativity point is really important because I think there is a lot of opportunity for those who are willing to create, because there is a lot of drive right now for people to consume. And I think the easiest example of that is just in social media, in content, is that there are just these massive industries that are driven to incentivize people to just consume more, whether it's 10, 15-second videos on your phone or movies or whatever the case may be, is that there is a massive drive to incentivize people to do that in some unique ways. That's not a new phenomenon, but I think that we're seeing it come about in some ways that we haven't really had to necessarily deal with in the past. And so I think what that could do is that it could create opportunities for people who have the creativity to take advantage of all of the new tools, the new opportunities that are out there, and do something unique with them. But I don't think that necessarily has to look like being on a podcast or creating videos, or necessarily be directly artistic. And so, Jonathan, I would be curious to hear you delve a little bit more into what kind of creativity that could be and what that could look like for someone who is wondering what the options are for them.
Well, I think that I like to go back to something you said, David. You said that, in the past, it was you pick a trade and you'd have a guaranteed employment. First of all, it's worth noting that's probably the closest thing to guaranteed employment you've got right now, is that if you are going into the trades, if you're going to blue collar type traditional trades, there's probably a more guaranteed employment path there than anything else at the moment. But
if you go into construction, you can build a lot of data centers.
Well, and so I was thinking about using it as an example in terms of, let's go back and say, so a couple of my uncles were electricians. And they were electricians because electricians got a slightly higher wage in the mill. And so for them, they went through their apprenticeship and they became electricians and they went to work at the mill, and it was a pretty good job. And then, because of, this was been the 70s. And so in the 80s, when Japanese steel came in and the American steel industry, kind of crashed, they were in better shape than some of my other uncles because they were able to work independently as electricians. And there was always a need for somebody to come in and do some electrical work and those kinds of things. And so in that sense, yes, they could have they got a job. They went to work for the mill. That was the big employer. That was the primary thing they were looking for. And they occasionally had some other side jobs. It would take a very unusual person to have taken that electrical skill and started a business. That would require a set of connections. It would require it would require a network. In other words, when the mill shut down, they didn't all start businesses. They did work on the side and they waited for the mill to reopen. And then eventually when the mill didn't reopen, then they were forced to travel out of state and do some different things, kind of chasing jobs. And then they told all their kids, go get a college degree so you don't have to do this thing. Okay, well, it's worth sort of pausing and looking when I talk about, having a perspective shift. Let's say you did the same thing today. And let's say that you, apprenticed and became an electrician and went through and got your journeyman's license and all those kinds of things. Well, where David and I live, there's a couple of big employers, and you could go and you could work for some of those employers. It's worth noting that there's multiple ones, and they all need to hire you, so that there's a lack of electricians, and so there's lots of options there. To David's point, you could also make crazy money, and we're talking 6-figure crazy money by traveling around and wiring up data centers. That's a huge need, and And a huge necessity is to do that. And so there's an opportunity to hit the road and take your trade on the road and go to where the work is. But then there's also another opportunity, which is it's never been easier to hang your shingle out and say, I do electrical work. And you don't need the network and you don't need the infrastructure that my uncles did. You need a Facebook page. And the demand is high enough. And so, but then we can go from there. If you want to do electrical work, but you've got more of an entrepreneurial bend, well, you can start your own company. If you start your own company, now that all the tools are available, building a big company on the trades is easier than it's ever been, which is not to say that it's easy. It's just easier than it's ever been. But then there's a whole other aspect here where there's lots and lots of people that need to learn electrical stuff. And so there's a whole teaching aspect here that can, cross into online training and all those kinds of things. Now, the point there is that before there was one ladder. You got your electrical training and you went to work for the mill. And if the mill didn't work out, you could do a little bit of side stuff, but you had to go someplace where there was another mill. And now, is it different? Yeah, because you're not sure exactly what to do with that. But David and I both know people who work for big companies, electricians, who work for themselves as electricians, who teach other people to be electricians, and who travel around and do electrical work at data centers. In other words, there's examples of all of those, and it's limited a little bit by your creativity, to David's point. But the potential and the possibility is bigger than it's ever been before. And that's where I think that there's a necessity to see the phenomenal opportunity that comes with not a ladder, but a jungle gym, right? Is it harder initially? Yeah, there's some ways you have to kind of figure out where to go. But if you're willing to do that and you're willing to press into that creativity, where you can go is far bigger, far wider, and far more interesting than I think it was a generation or two ago. And that, to me, is pretty exciting.
Yeah. I think that is really exciting too. And so I guess as we kind of wrap up here, I think to continue to speak to the perspective of the young person who feels a little bit jaded or potentially just a little bit overwhelmed, or someone who knows a young person like this, someone who feels overwhelmed by the possibilities and, potentially could see, okay, yeah, maybe if I, expand my possibilities a little bit and I'm willing to potentially venture into something that I am not necessarily a huge fan of, or I don't necessarily think I would be able to enjoy initially, but it could be a job opportunity nonetheless. And it's just wondering, how in the world do I even get started in something like that? Because I think the lie, unfortunately, that our world continues to perpetuate is that if you need to get started in an industry, you need a college degree. And so I think there's probably a lot of young people who go like, well, I either need experience or a degree to get started into something like this. And so how in the world do I find opportunities like this? And it could just be very daunting. So I think addressing that kind of concern and feeling of overwhelm could potentially be helpful.
Well, I think you have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is work is good. It's inherently good. You should want to work. You should want to create. You should want to produce. And I don't mean that in some sort of like you should want to be a cog in the machine. I mean, like you should want to contribute to the rest of society would be the secular way to say it. But as Christians, we would say you want to be able to participate in the redemption of all things. That God ultimately brings that about, but he gives you an opportunity to be his hands and feet in that. And that is not an opportunity to be missed. It's one of the grand adventures of our lifetime. And so to restore not just the dignity, but the excitement and the worth and the value of work, and to say, okay, this is a good thing that I want to do. And now just to be clear, and let's expand work to say that includes work you get a paycheck for and includes work that you get a different kind of paycheck for. In other words, not all work comes with salaries, but there is a calling to work to contribute effort to the betterment of those around you and to the betterment of the world that you're in, and to address evil, to celebrate beauty, to defy evil, to celebrate beauty, and to promote truth and goodness. And so, just to start there, and then the second thing would be. And I know it's going to sound frustrating to young people listening to this, but we talk about this all the time in Navigate. It's like, well, wherever you're going, you're going to leave from here. And so it's a question of what is in front of you right now that gives you an opportunity to build skill and to build experience. And if that is a work opportunity, go to the work opportunity. If that's an education opportunity, go for the education opportunity. If you're not sure, start kicking around with those ideas in mind. Don't think about what do I do now that'll prepare me for what I'm going to do 60 years from now. Think about what can I do now that will give me a skill that I don't have and give me experience that I don't have. And, is that a volunteer opportunity? Is that an employment opportunity? Is that an education opportunity? Often it's all three of those things. And lean into that. And then I think that the one thing that I'm confident in guaranteeing you is that when you do that, doors keep opening. In other words, you'll stand from a new place and go, oh, I now have this skill and this experience. I can do this. I can do this skill and this experience. And one of two things will happen. You'll be like, I love this. And you roll into it some more. Or and this may be more common, I don't like this. And you're like, okay, but now I know I don't, but I also have skill and experience and I'll roll into the next thing and to transfer that over. And so, in a jungle gym, for a ladder, it's like, yeah, put your feet in the rungs and go. For the jungle gym, it's like, okay, well, go up the first thing and see where it leads. And it may mean you have to come down. It may mean you have to go sideways. It may mean you have to reset, but you're still going to have to climb. And so there's the first step becomes essential in either of these scenarios.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. And it reminds me personally of just where kind of my kind of career jungle gym ended up going after I finished my graduate degree, is that I finished my finished grad school, and I was attending a university that was very well known for having a very good job placement rate. And so I was interviewing with a lot of very large companies. And then it just so happened that my graduating year was spring of 2020. And so at that point, then suddenly no one was hiring because nobody had any idea what was going on. And so what I had thought was going to be pretty much a guaranteed, really solid career path, like a career ladder that was going to be set up right in front of me and have a real clear path to some good success, immediately got blown over. And then I thought, well, what in the world do I do now? And so I ended up just trying to do a little bit of my own thing. I did some freelance work. I kind of started my own freelance marketing agency and just did a bunch of work for some other companies. And I messed up a lot of stuff, to be truly frank with you. Like it was, I look back on it now and there was a lot of frustration and disappointment in that time, but I think I learned so much in that time about some of the practical skills that I get to use now, but also just about how to just use what you have and keep trying and experiment with things and just see where it goes. And I wasn't making a ton of money at the time, but I look back on it now and say, man, I'm really glad that I went through that period, because it facilitated a lot of what I needed in order to get where I am now. And thankfully, after about a year or so of being in that position, then I ended up finding my way to Unbound, and I'm extremely grateful for that.
Well, it's worth noting, finding your way to Unbound. You found your way to Unbound in part because the business you started attracted attention from an alumni and somebody who's working for us who was leaving a position that we had and recommended you and said, hey, have you seen what David's doing? I think he's working on his own doing that. And it went from like, oh, David is a student that we had to, wait, David has experience working on his own doing these kinds of things. And that, so it's interesting. And if you're listening, you should pay attention to this. From David's perspective, the ladder got blown over. He had to do something different, and he wasn't doing a fantastic job at it. I don't mean like in terms of his skill. Like he was learning things and failing and trying to figure things out and not making a lot of money. And yet that thing is exactly what opened the door to what he's doing now. Because we turned around and looked at that, it's like, oh man, somebody who has enough guts to go out on their own and do the entrepreneurship thing and try to put a business together. Think about all the skills that they have, but think about how well they've taught themselves and what they've learned. We can work with that almost at whatever skill level it is. And, from our perspective, it's been a fantastic deal. You can ask David privately what he thinks about it. But the point is that thing that was harder, or that thing that didn't seem like it was successful, was the thing that opened the next door. And, I'd say the same thing. What we're doing now is opening the next door, both for us as a company, but also for us perhaps as individuals, right? It's the experience and the skills that you're building that opens up the next thing. And sometimes you don't see what that is. I'm old enough now that I'm really careful about saying my career has any kind of relevance to today, except for the fact that I tell people, when I graduated from college, I took a job that I didn't know existed when I went to college. And I left that job for a job that didn't exist when I graduated from college. And every job I've had since then, I was the first person to hold that job. And so to me, what the big takeaway from that is, the idea of me worrying at 18 that I didn't know what I was going to do for the rest of my life seems absolutely ridiculous, since there was no way to pick the things I did because they literally didn't exist. and each one only became apparent after I had the skill and experience from the job that I was in that enabled me to unlock the next door and the next opportunity. And I don't claim that my path is necessarily either unique or the prototype, but I think that there's elements of that are true for almost anybody in today's world, right? Like that whatever you're doing, you're likely building the skills and experience to unlock the next thing. And it's also pretty likely that you don't know what the next thing is now. And it may not even be the next thing doesn't even exist yet. So.
Yeah. One more story here that is just far too good to pass up. And it's not my own. It is actually of one of our most loyal podcast listeners. That would be my dad. Hi, Dad. And he has a really funny story of his career where he finished his degree in electrical engineering back in the day. And he went down and he got an electrical engineering job with Texas Instruments. And so he got packed up from Missouri. He moved all the way down there. He went into the office to report for his first day of work. And the HR manager comes up to him and says, so the electrical engineering position that you were hired for doesn't exist anymore. And he was like, okay, so what do I do? And she asked, do you know anything about making software, like developing software for computers? And he said, I took a couple of classes on it. And she said, great. Do you want a job doing that? And that's exactly how he started into his 40-year career doing software development. And so that was nowhere on his bingo card. But the fact that, he was just decided, well, that's the opportunity in front of me. And I guess we'll just see where that leads is, this is not a new phenomenon, I think. And hopefully what young people and those who know and support other young people can take away from this is that we're not trying to be here and say, oh, like, it's worked out great for us. Like if you just if you just work hard enough, then you'll be able to just make it through. We're not denying that there are challenges for sure, and that there are some definite puzzles to try to figure out, and that it can be a really frustrating experience at times. I think what we're hoping to convey through all of this is that I think, especially if you are someone who has the hope of Christ, that and the redemptive view of work that we've talked about, that God is going to use you to create value in some really amazing ways if you are willing to look for the opportunities that he gives you. And I think especially when you are willing to be open to his creativity and how he will orchestrate opportunities for you, and you are willing to take some risks, take advantage of some of those opportunities, then it can actually end up being way cooler than the straightforward career ladder that has been the stereotype for so long.
All that being said, it is still a bit of a jungle gym out there. And if you could use a little bit of navigational help, then we might suggest that you could check out beunbound.us. There are a couple of threads that ran through this entire conversation, and that is the relationships. We talked about, David's relationship with somebody is what led him to where he is now, and we see that happen again and again. The ability to develop resilience and to understand some of the big ideas, the foundational ideas we talked about in terms of the value of work and those kinds of things, and the ability to try, fail, and learn and go from that, which happens when you do real life projects that actually have some implications and some failure possibilities with them. Those things, of course, describe the kind of projects and programs that we run through Unbound. And so if those are interesting to you, we would suggest that you check out beunbound.us, especially our Ascend program. And we might suggest a little bit of urgency to that as we're moving into the later part of the spring. And those courses and those programs are starting to fill up as we come into the hot part of the summer in terms of enrollment. And so take some time to look at those if you're interested. Until next time, thank you for listening. We hope that this is helpful. We hope that more than anything, don't worry so much about the technical aspects. The things we said there are helpful, but if you could grasp one thing from this, it is the value and dignity of work. And the fact that that is true, it is universal. It doesn't matter what time and age that you're living in. And then this perspective shift that, are there challenges? Absolutely. But there's also opportunities. And so we would encourage you to have an abundance mindset. There's always opportunities for those who are willing to take the time and to look. The effort might be slightly different, but the rewards often correspond to the efforts. The more effort you put in, the more reward there is. And so that's a cool time and place to be alive. Until next time, be unbound.